Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show about Canadian culture and the way it informs this nation's history. My name is Patrick, and with me is the cool to my gang, Mr. Mackenzy.
And with me today is the paprika to my salt and pepper, Patrick.
How does that even make any sense?
I remember it from Blue's Clues.
Oh my god, what a
There was a salt and pepper shaker, and their child was paprika.
How does salt and pepper make paprika? I don't get that. It was just a random thing.
How does salt and pepper shakers have a baby?
I mean, they just shake at each other, I guess.
Do they just mix their salt and pepper in a bowl?
And that somehow gives a red pepper thing? It doesn't matter.
I guess the pepper shaker was interested in some other people.
We're going to stop this conversation right now because today we're actually going to be talking about a rather important topic, right? We kind of alluded to it last week, and that is the Durham report. So in kind of the aftermath, but not really, as the investigation for the rebellion started before they officially ended, right? There was a report that was being investigated and written about what the causes were. And this is what we're going to talk about today. And the report itself, I think, is not only just a historical document, but I think we'll be able to actually gather quite a conversation about its literary aspects. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. We'll see how that goes. But I think there's a potential for that also. Before we get into it, Mackenzie, do you have any opening thoughts about the Durham report, like initial reactions about it, your initial knowledge of the Durham report?
Sure. I can tell you one thing. It's because of the Durham report that I know what the word assimilation means.
Oh, for real?
Yeah. So it goes I get to Canadian high school, boarding school, whatever, and then we were doing class, and we start talking about this stuff, and my teacher says the word assimilation. I'm like, what does that mean? Because that was never a word that popped up in my American history class and the Bermuda history classes. And she's like, well, this is what assimilation means. For those, I'm not even going to try to explain assimilation. It's basically you're trying to remove something by incorporating it, You're trying to absorb it and then by absorption, delete it. Yeah,
exactly. To absorb it into a wider body.
And for this case, the French-Canadian culture. And so in related to the Durham report, that's what we sort of learned again from the high school background. It was never something, again, it's one of those things we always study the after effects and how it eventually led to responsible government was the response. And we learned that people hated it for the most part and that Durham kind of was fucking stupid with it, trying to assimilate the French Canadian people, and that worked horribly, and we're still dealing with those repercussions today.
Yeah, that's pretty much the gist of it, right? There would be a lot of recommendations for the report, and as you say, the reactions to it would either be atrocious or mixed or positive, right? It was kind of a very mixed bag. However, just because the report suggested a lot of things, including responsible government, doesn't mean that they were necessarily implemented immediately, right? And there are reasons
most
for
of
that.
It was rejected.
Yeah, a lot of it was rejected, and we'll see why later and what the consequences of that were. But yeah.
It was just, again, Britain being Britain, they get this list of things of this is what you can do to make the people stop fighting. They pick the worst. They pick one part, and it's the worst part that they pick.
Oh, yeah. But I think I wouldn't say typical British fashion because it's not limited to them.
Yeah,
but
that's just very human.
Yeah, it's very human. And also, I don't think it started off entirely from a place of wanting to screw everyone over, as has been the case in the past, right? There have been instances in the past, especially with when dealing with empires, when the goal was entirely to screw people over.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that the idea behind the report or in wanting to investigate the rebellions necessarily came from a place entirely of maliciousness. And one of the reasons why I say that is by the very choice of the Earl of Durham to make that report, which we'll get into. I want to cover a bit what his politics were. And I think that'll kind of enlighten the choice for that guy to do the report.
Right. And again, I say like typical Britain. I just mean typical in the fact that like we've seen multiple documents now of what Britain gets up to,
Mhm.
and they're just the ones that do it for the most, like, that we're looking at. It's not super special to them. Everybody does it. It's just funny that it always seems to happen with Britain here, you know?
Yeah, of course. And because they were the power, they theoretically still are the power in Canada for for
Mhm.
quite some time, right? So any reports or commissions or official bills are inevitably going to be British in nature for hundreds of years, really. So typical Britain because it's the only option.
Typical Britain because they're the major empire of the time.
Yep, exactly. So getting into it a bit, I think what we could start off with is just an overview of who Durham was. And it kind of gives an idea of what his mentality was going into this whole thing, right? Obviously, we've spent 3 episodes covering what the rebellions were. If you want to know more about it, listeners, you have like 3 hours worth of material to
So
catch
much
you up on.
material.
Right. I think we've pretty much covered it from most angles possible. Where the Earl of Durham comes in, because his name wasn't Durham, it was a title. Durham is a place in England. His real name is John George Lambton. Durham was a politician in England, and a well-established one, as a matter of fact, before even entering Upper and Lower Canada. And he had a career that really started in 1813, so almost 25 years before the rebellions happened. And he was known as Radical Jack.
Mm-hmm.
Radical is a very big term here, once again, because as we were talking about with the rebels or
Freedom
the
fighters.
insurrection, right? The freedom fighters in Canada, radicalism had a very different term, as in anything that went outside of conventional British systems was radical. So he was called Radical Jack because of his progressive Whig ideas.
What is a Whig, Patrick?
Says he in such a convincing question.
It's not like I have a script or notes. What are you talking about?
No, exactly. But a Whig, and not to be confused, by the way, with wig the hairpiece, a Whig, W-H-I-G, is a political party, or was a vague term for what was then known as a liberal, right? So much in the same way that in the past we've used the term Tory, for example, to refer to conservatives, Whigs are kind of the more liberal-minded people of the time.
When you said hairpiece, I thought you said something really different.
What did you think I said?
Herpes. I was like, wig nut. I was like, what?
Yeah, obviously, we're referring to herpes, or liberals, or both. Liberal herpes. Anyway, dumb, very, very dumb thing aside. So WHIG Whigs, exactly, are a bit more progress-minded and liberal-oriented people. Mm-hmm. At that time, what that meant is different than what it means today, obviously.
Yeah.
Right? Ideas of progress and liberalism were not the same thing in the 19th century as they are in the 21st. And at the time, a liberal was more of someone who supported religious toleration and kind of mixed a few democratic and Republican ideals, right? Republican, as we know it from the States, a bit more popular representation and a will towards more active industrialization and a reliance on capitalism as we would know it today. Mm-hmm. So that would contrast with, as we've talked about in episodes such as the one on Halliburton in episode 17, Tories were much more monarchical, a bit more conservative in their view of society and culture, right? Who weren't necessarily opposed to industrialization, but were much more willing to limit its rapid expansion, for example. Already, just based off of that, I think we can understand why he would have been an interesting choice for the British government to send over in the aftermath of a rebellion, right? Mm-hmm. But on top of that, we can talk a bit about what he was promoting concretely within England that will really solidify his eventual position as a reporter in Upper Canada and Lower Canada. In the 1830s, beginning of the 1830s, he would help draft what was known in England as the Reform Bill, which, as the name suggests, was kind of a set of laws that would help change and alter the way that British politics and society kind of operated. So, for example, it allowed for a better representation of shifting population densities through a recreation of the electoral map. More people were allowed to vote. It's no longer just rich landowners, but smaller landowners and farmers, shopkeepers, and a few little things here and there. Obviously, it wasn't perfect because women were still not allowed to vote, which would come much later, much later, way too later. But it's progress, right? It's something.
I think it's an interesting thing to bring up that this bill had some sort of progress just because of the fact, again, I don't know what it was like in your education, but my education, there was this big vilification of Durham.
For sure.
And there's always interesting to see that, like, this is a real dude who was, like, they're not really a villain.
Not well, at least he became a villain in a certain context, right? For certain people.
From a certain perspective.
And I can understand. I try to understand as wide a range of opinions as possible, just as a principle.
For sure, always.
But I can understand why getting a Quebec education or a French Canadian education here, why from that perspective he would be considered more of a villain, right? Just because of the comments that we'll see later he would make about the French Canadians. But also, yeah, it's something that I think I would have appreciated more, which I certainly didn't get in my own schools, was that perspective of, he was for his time somewhat liberal, right? It's not perfect. It's not a complete game changer, right?
Again, like his bill is still limiting women's voting, right? It's just really interesting to me. We look at these people and there's always so many more layers than what people want you to believe,
Absolutely. And I can understand that for the purposes of a high school education, you want to try to condense a lot of stuff into a year's worth of class, right? You have a lot to cover. But I think that little level of nuance would have definitely helped create a better portrait of the character. Just knowing that what he did in England was rather progressive for its time. Because that bill was one of the first ones in British history to do that level of reform, actually. So it is a trailblazer in a sense.
I think that that was my main point just with Durham. It's interesting, again, this historical figure that just sort of got sent over. Again, we'll be going into more detail about why he became this sort of the boogeyman of the French Canadian culture.
Rightfully so, honestly.
Obviously, yes. Obviously, like, again, assimilation is dumb. It never works.
We could make a whole conversation about that, but I would argue that the only way in which assimilation works is either because the minority population wants it as well, which is never the case, or if that population is completely decimated to the point where...
And at that point, that's not assimilation. That's genocide.
Exactly, right? So it doesn't work on any level, I would say. At least in terms of being forced onto people.
Right.
So anyway, that's broadly speaking his kind of... it's Lambton's, or I'll just refer to him as Durham the entire time because that's what he's known as, even though it's not his name. But that's kind of the basic gist of his politics and his pre-Canada history. And that's really, those reforms and these ideas is really what's going to get him appointed to investigate in 1838 the reasons behind the uprisings in the Canadas. And he's made Governor General in that year. Now, there's something interesting to note here, because as we touched upon last episode, the rebellions themselves went on into 1839, right? Into November of 1839 with the Nelson brothers leading some rather important uprisings throughout the south of Quebec, for example. And in this kind of downtime of the rebellions, Durham is already sent in 1838 to investigate the reasons why it had happened, as if it was over. So I just find it's a kind of interesting period where the British believe it's over and believe that they can damage control as soon as possible, even though it's about to explode arguably even harder. So in 1838, he's sent over to the Canadas, and his whole goal is to figure out, through talking with the population in both Upper and Lower Canada, what happened, right? And he's going to go about it through ways that are immediately flawed if you think about it for more than 2 seconds. I have a note here which I thought was rather interesting. So the British Prime Minister at the time, right, he's the one who helped appoint Durham to the Canadas because, as we've mentioned, for those popular and liberal principles that he represents. But I do want to make it clear that Durham was not necessarily the most popular person either. He wasn't like this universally adored figure of progress.
No.
Because, as I wrote down a little quote here, which I thought was very interesting, he is also described as avaricious of mob popularity, as if he were a Democrat at heart, right? And it kind of represents this idea of him as wanting radical reform as soon as possible and completely destabilizing the entire system in one fell swoop, which I think is a bit exaggerated.
Probably part of the reason why they sent him to Canada of all places.
Yeah, because they were like, well, if anyone's going to understand those weird and wacky radicals, it's going to be him.
Yeah, if anybody's looking for that mob, it's going to be let's send the guy who's in charge of the mobs to the mob people. That's going to make everything better.
Again, it's not that dumb an idea when you think about it just for within the context of that time, right? It's this idea of, well, he's obviously going to understand them because he's like-minded in terms of politics.
Oh, for sure. Like that wasn't the worst play. It's more, again, it's just more such a difference in culture and understanding each other's cultures. But
speaking of that, I think we can kind of segue actually into the reactions by British North Americans to his arrival. Mm-hmm. I think that's a nice segue into the population of British North America. Before he even makes his report, before he's even the famous or the boogeyman Durham, as you mentioned, just initial and immediate reactions. So for example, English-speaking merchants, how do you think they would react to someone like Durham?
I think they'd probably be happy, you know. I mean, merchants are always going to be cautiously happy with these things because they're never 100% sure, and that's how they stay wealthy and empowered. But Durham was the kind of guy who'd probably be promoting, and like he was for merging the two, right? Upper Inlander Canada. Mm-hmm. And that would be nothing but good probably for the merchants. It would probably make trade a lot easier for them.
Exactly. Right. So trade would be a lot easier. And also just the idea of greater trade, period. Right. Mm-hmm. So as you were saying, and as we mentioned earlier, Whigs were much more capitalist in their ideals. Right. And so people like those merchants who were English speaking and so who had that association, that much closer association with the British, would definitely already have that ground on which to be in accord with Durham. For the reformers themselves, I think that goes without saying that they were sympathetic, right, politically with Durham. He was there as a representation of them from across the ocean.
He was a reformer.
Surprising no one, they were on board with him coming there.
That was the plan.
Right? They wanted the British attention, they got it. And finally, surprising no one again, what do you think the Tories thought of Durham?
The same reasons why he was loved by the reformers? They probably disliked him for the exact same thing.
Pretty much. So I wrote down a quote here by Sir Beverley Robinson, which is probably the quintessential Tory pretentious name that I can imagine. Sir Beverley Robinson. So he describes Durham as, quote, he is unsound in important points, does not look temperately at difficulties, is rash in action, and is deeply committed to a destructive party and a destructive policy.
Seems kind of hyperbolic, but sure, keep going.
That's it. But you're right. It is hyperbolic. It's perfectly encapsulates, I think, this Tory mentality of changing as little as possible, of kind of enacting change, but through the proper channels.
Enacting change of stagnation.
And I don't want to give this impression that, you know, there's only bad and only good with the Tories and Liberals respectively, right? The Tories and Whigs. I have issues with both sides, by the way.
And there's issues with both philosophies, you know, like crazy radical change, if that's all you're doing, things are just going to be changing all the time, and eventually it's all going to fall apart. Like, the Tories weren't entirely wrong saying, like, sometimes we need to slow things down and keep, like, certain policies in place.
In this case, I find it funny to highlight the staunch opposition to a guy who's ostensibly trying to do good.
Yeah.
I just thought it was an interesting point to highlight.
There's a problem that needs a fixing.
So there's a few major points that we can cover from Durham's governance and his investigation. If you'd remember, I think we talked about it in part 1 or 2, probably part 2, of the Rebellions series that we did. We mentioned that there was a special council put in place in Lower Canada, for example. Do you remember what it was exactly?
Rings a bell, but it's also been a couple of episodes, and the Rebellions kind of like took over my brain for a little bit.
Yeah, it all kind of blended in. Basically, the special council was a really small group that was put into place to directly govern Lower Canada during the upheavals.
Okay, so standard operation then.
It was only put in place in Lower Canada. There was no such action done in Upper Canada.
Of course.
Perfectly encapsulating the British Empire through and through, right? But it was specifically there to limit the democratic powers of Lower Canada, to make sure that everything was as stable as possible while things calmed down. And then after, it was supposed to be taken away once everything had passed.
Was it taken away?
Yeah, eventually it was.
Okay.
But it would take a while before it would. But
it would take the merging of Upper and Lower Canada.
Pretty much. Yeah. I'd have to check exactly when it was disbanded. But it did eventually, certainly by the time the two Canadas were merged, it was gone. But when exactly before or during, I'm not sure. I'd have to check.
Right, of course.
The point is, that's what's in place by the time Durham arrives. And so immediately when he gets there, one of his first acts is to take that council, eliminate most of its members, and put his people in. Keep the system of special council, but have everyone agree with him.
That's... Oh, but who was the guy that we read about way earlier that did the same thing when he was the mayor?
It was Mackenzy.
Yes.
So William Mackenzy did pretty much the same thing.
Sorry about that, you guys. My bad.
Again, classic joke. But yeah, it's pretty much the same thing that was done, right? These reformers, it's kind of ironic, who were advocating for a much more democratic or Republican style government were the ones who were like, nah, but let's not do that.
How can you say this guy is avaricious of the mob popularity when the first thing he does is just install all of his yes men?
I almost want to say that it's because he really wants to get shit done. And that's the fastest way that he can do it. Yeah,
for sure. It's just funny how these people like say these hyperbolic statements, and then like that was not true at all. If this guy was really avaricious of mob popularity, that would be the furthest thing he would do.
Yeah. So yeah, it is kind of weird. I agree. But however, to be perfectly fair, another thing that he did was to pardon a lot of the insurrectionists that were jailed in the Canadas.
Solid play. Solid move on the Durham.
Honestly, yes. Like, don't, even though that he would kind of contradict himself later on, but don't alienate the base that you're trying to satisfy, or at least trying to understand.
If only he was halfway there. He was so close.
He was so close because guess what else he did?
What else did he do?
He kind of prompted the exile of many of the leadership.
That I can understand. Like, that's what every country does. You know, you exile the people who were in charge, send them to Australia or whatever.
Sure. But also, if you'll recall, that's pretty much what led to even greater armed revolts later, right? Papineau, Mackenzy, and all that had suddenly mandates for their arrest, and they were either forced to go back to go to the States, to go to Europe. As you mentioned, they were sent to Australia, some of them. And while the idea, as you say, is, you know, if you cut off the head, the rest of the so-called disloyal body would fail, it also just radicalized a lot of these people more and made them even more willing to go up against the British later.
And also, that's not really cutting off the head, you know? That's just sending the head to somewhere else.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it was harder to come back from that somewhere else at that time. So.
Oh, for sure. Like, again, we've covered these rebellions and they failed, obviously.
Mhm.
But
yeah, again, I kind of get it, but this kind of brings us into the timeline where we kind of started the initial series on the rebellions. So we started off a bit before, and Durham's arrival kind of coincided with the beginnings of upheavals, but not really armed ones. And as he would send out mandates for the arrests, this is pretty much where the solid insurrections would begin and where we meet up with our narrative proper, as we've covered in the last 3 episodes.
This rebellion, it's just put us all over the place.
It has, but also I don't see any other better way to cover it, honestly.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Now, if you were in Durham's shoes, Mackenzie, going into the Canadas, who would you go see and talk to just to understand the reasons behind it?
Behind the rebellion?
Yes.
Well, I know who I would see. I'm going to take a guess it wasn't who Durham saw. I would probably, might do well to speak with the French people who did the whole rebellion thing.
Yep, that's a solid start and definitely one that I would get behind.
To understand, hey, why are you doing this, man? Why don't we have a nice talk and we can figure something out?
Mm-hmm, definitely. So I think he kind of listened to the first half of your suggestion of spending most of his time in Lower Canada. So off to a strong start. Seems like a pretty recurring motif with Durham is you're starting off strong, setting a strong basis.
Halfway there, man.
Halfway there, and he spends most of his time speaking.
Wait, can I guess?
Yes, go.
All right. He spends it with the merchants, doesn't he? The English merchants.
Yes, he does.
Damn, it's so easy when you have the notes in front of you.
You don't have to give them a peek behind the curtain, Mackenzie. God damn it. Pretend a bit. It's theater.
Yes, oh great and powerful Oz.
Yeah, so as Mackenzie was joking about, a lot of Durham's time in Lower Canada was spent speaking to those English merchants who we mentioned before as being pretty much on board with who he was as a person.
And I can see what he's trying to do. Again, Canada's not so much a nation right now, so he has to speak to the people that sort of represent the colonial part of this. And in the colonial part of it, the most important people are going to be the English-speaking merchants.
Yeah,
as
definitely.
part of that larger triangle trade, providing the raw resources back to the mother country. He has to keep them happy.
And especially from his point of view, as we've mentioned, as more of a capitalist mindset, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of really the foundation of the British Empire is in its economic power. As you mentioned, yes, that's where you would go to. But also, they're not the ones who revolted.
No. He should have spoken to the French insurrectionists as well, if the fact that he didn't speak to them at all.
He spoke a bit, but it was really disproportionately not.
It was a couple of handshakes,
Probably, yeah, something like that.
It's have you seen there's a Key and Peele skit where one of them is playing Obama and he's going shaking hands with all the people, and when it's with he's playing Obama shaking hands, and when it's with the white people, it's a very formal handshake, oh hi. But when it's with the black people, it's the big hugs and the handshakes and everything. And in my head, I'm just imagining Durham doing that, French instructions, oh hey there, hello.
Nice
and
to
then
meet
English
you.
speaking merchant, it's yo, what's up, my man? How you doing?
That's surprisingly accurate. It's terrifyingly accurate, actually. It's not surprising. It's horrifying how accurate that is. But yeah, one of the main points, obviously, that he would get from the English-speaking merchants is their desire to, obviously, their opposition to the French-Canadian insurrectionists, but also they're the ones who most actively supported their assimilation into the English-speaking world that was British North America, mostly at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Them and the Tories pretty much are on board with that assimilation. But, as we mentioned, he did speak a bit to the French speakers, and he did go a bit to Upper Canada to meet some of the reformers. And apparently that's more where he got the idea of the responsible government, which is something that he had been somewhat advocating for in England, but it's in talking to the Upper Canadian reformers that he understood that that was part of what they had wanted in the first place in Canada as well.
Right.
Just to cap things off in the investigation section, it's a rather short section, right? We just talked about him meeting 2, maybe 3 groups, but this is something that I didn't know when I learned about it in school, but he didn't actually spend that much time in Canada, in the sense that he spent basically a couple of months there. And once the British got wind of his kind of arbitrary actions, we're looking at you, special counsel, they started the process of reversing his orders and contradicting the Governor General that they had sent in the first place.
Durham, we're sending you because you're the perfect guy. Oh no, that was a mistake.
That's, in a nutshell, what happened. And while he wasn't forced to leave, right, he still officially kept his post. But after a few months, he was basically so disillusioned with the pushback that his own government, his own British government, was giving him, that he just went home with a half-assed investigation.
Oh, fair enough.
Fair enough, but also, like, I think that taints a lot of the writing of it after, personally. And that's one of the reasons why I think that the Durham report can almost be analyzed more in a literary sense than an official report sense.
Oh, yeah.
And we'll get to that. But first, I need to take a break for a minute. And we're back. So,
sorry for the interruption, folks.
I'm not sorry. Unlike you, I'm not a superhuman being, Mackenzy.
Unlike me, who uses the bathroom before recording.
Moving on.
It really doesn't.
This is so dumb. But anyway. So, as we mentioned, Durham kind of half-asses this investigation. And he heads
Durham
back
half-assed everything, and then he got sent back to Britain.
Yep. What I find interesting is that, honestly, I would have taken for granted that that report just never would have come out, right? I don't think anyone kind of expected it to come out.
And why did it?
Well, it kind of did because he was apparently very, very protective of it. Like, that's something that he legitimately wanted to do.
Of course.
And from accounts from his life, including his wife, including his assistants like Charles Buller and stuff like that, apparently even once he started getting sick, I forget what illness he had come up with, he would still continue working on this report. Like, it's something that would legitimately interest him.
The report?
And he would actually maintain his job as a politician. Like, so he was still within the British government and he was still active in political changes. It was just that that part of it had kind of crumbled. And I think he just wanted to prove that it was still a worthwhile endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd have to check the legality of it, but I guess theoretically it's unofficial, right? It's an unofficial report because of his removal from the project over a year before it was presented in 1839, right? So I don't know. It doesn't really matter ultimately because it was presented and the British did listen to it.
God damn it.
Yeah.
That's so strange for me. Like, why would... So he half-assed the report, but then he was still interested enough to present it to the Parliament.
So I think he was able to... We kind of talked about this off air before. I think he was able to kind of skim on the investigation because according to certain sources, right, and I've looked at a few accounts, but Durham apparently had his ideas about what the causes were before getting there. So
Sounds about right.
Yeah, it sounds about right, when you know a bit more about how he acted in the Canadas. So in that sense, I guess that he knew where he was headed before actually investigating, and the investigating was a formality for him. And it was filled with a kind of confirmation bias.
This whole thing, when you look at it, it really is just one long chain of unfortunate events and screw-ups, and just everything was ruined before they got it started.
And that's why, as I mentioned before our break, I kind of consider this almost more in line with a politically charged book, right? It's almost 150 pages, right? It could be a book at this point, than a genuine political report. It's a book that was listened to and that was taken seriously, but I would almost place this alongside the likes of Halliburton's The Clockmaker, right? Which we covered a few times on the show before, right? We kind of come back to this as this epitome of Toryism at the time.
Tories!
But I think that's kind of a big thing to take into consideration, is that much in the same way that Halliburton was using comedy to expound very specific political values about Nova Scotia, Durham had these ideas about, which we're going to get into, by the way, we're going to specify what these ideas are, but
Eventually.
had these very specific ideas before writing anything, and he would just basically create a medium through which he could expound them and people would listen, much like Halliburton. I guess that's for me why it's more of a book than anything else, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I'd say so. If the document is unofficial, then it loses a lot of credence as like this historical piece, you know?
Does it though?
I think it does, mostly because of the fact that it means that it was something he decided to finish on his own time. And he also ended up finishing it without the backing of any sort of historical society or government that was backing him up, you know? So it becomes a very important historical document for sure, and it's something that you'll study at. It's written as a sort of historical document. It would be, but I don't know. It's just from other travel writing I've read around that time, it falls more into the literary category. You know?
Yeah, it's almost like a nonfiction kind of literature.
Yeah, exactly. It's like people who write their own sort of like the philosophers who write their own treatises and all that. It's nonfiction, but it's not sort of, again, it's an unofficial thing that he's writing, you know. So we'd probably still study it in a historical document, in a historical context, but I don't know, that I think you're right in that it starts to fall into that literary category.
To me, it's only official in the sense that it was listened to on a government level.
Yeah, it's in a very gray area due to the fact that it was listened to, points were taken from it, and the government acted upon it.
Now, I'd have to make sure of what I'm saying, of the officiality of it, but that's pretty much what I've gathered from it, from my research, that's kind of what everyone was kind of taking it as.
Mm-hmm.
But we've kind of been alluding to it here and there throughout. Do you remember, or from your classes, or from your general knowledge, what the major aspects of the Durham report are?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to harp on assimilation again. We know that was the main one.
Yep.
And I think it was the Union was another part of what was taken from it. That was, from my vague recollections, I think those were the major points that were taken into consideration.
Those are the two massive ones that are really important, right? So I kind of condensed them. So I noted down here the salient aspects that popped out to Durham as he produced the report, right?
Mm-hmm.
First of all, his vision was that the Upper Canadians, right, though they were loyal, were kind of unhappy with the conflict between a petty and insolent Tory clique, that's a quote,
mm-hmm.
and the so-called people. Right. This is a reference to the Family Compact, right, which we've discussed on previous episodes, as it was called in Lower Canada, the Chateau Clique. It was kind of this way of referencing the aristocratic Tories who kind of controlled economically and politically the place, and that Durham saw as problematic to the development of the economy in the Canadas. That's how he viewed the Upper Canadians. After his couple months investigation, that's what he came up with.
Right.
Secondly, he kind of understood that while we've been saying that he wanted responsible government, he also didn't want too much popular power, right? And that's another thing that came to his mind either before or during the investigation, where it was still important to keep somewhat of a aristocratic power, a governing elite, if you will,
mm-hmm.
to still allow the middle class to have some power by bringing its representatives into what was then known as the executive branch of the government.
I see it more as him because part of that sort of landowning governor elite would have been the seigneurs.
Yes.
I see him sort of saying, I don't want the seigneurs to have power. Again, playing into this sort of his other major point of assimilation, breaking up the sort of French-speaking people and people of French-Canadian history who do have power. That seems to be part of the plan,
Yep.
Meanwhile, the new power, the new money of the English merchants get to keep it.
And one of the ways, again, we keep alluding to it, one of the ways in which he would go about this was apparently this middle ground, this concession of a responsible government, where it wouldn't entirely be a republic like in the States, but it would still have a governing ruling class, British, as you mentioned, that was somewhat beholden to some people below. Right? That was kind of the middle ground that he brought and the general idea with which he was writing his report.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, with those three broad ideas, right, there are two problems that he pinpoints specifically as the reasons why the rebellion happened in the first place, what his report was supposed to tell us. Do you remember what that was? We talked about it, I think, in part 2, right? Do you remember what his single most important line of that report is that we mentioned?
It was the French and the English, where you had two cultures trying to live in the same spot.
Right.
This town ain't big enough for the both of us.
Mm-hmm. The entire quote is, "I found two nations warring in the bosom of a single state."
That's some strong language. That's some good language too.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm just gonna take a second to enjoy that little piece of writing.
The report is interminably long with massive paragraphs, as you mentioned, but the actual literary language that he uses is not that bad. It's quite enjoyable.
The distinction between nations and state is so good.
Yes, very concise, and you understand everything he means just by 10 words. Great.
And great use of the metaphor. Bosom, your line that literally legitimately goes straight to Mother Nation.
Absolutely. That being said, it's bullshit.
Oh yeah, total fucking lie.
But,
well, not total fucking lie, but still bullshit.
Yes. But, it is a great line.
It's a golden turd.
Honest, yeah. I have nothing to add to that. Great stuff. So,
that's why I'm brought
just
here.
kind of condensing it down. So, in his idea, a lot of the conflicts in Lower Canada were issues between French and English, rather than between the people and the government.
Which is an oversimplification of the problem.
Definitely. Again, in a sense, he's not entirely wrong in the sense that the French tended to be what we call now lower class people, right, of Lower Canada, and the English tended to be upper class.
Mm-hmm.
But their conflict was not racial, right, or national, right? It was economical, it was social. It had very little to do with the fact of linguistic distinctions in themselves. But there was a second point that kind of extends out of this first one. And I wrote here that the French were determined to survive where they couldn't. Couldn't is interesting here. The entire quote is, "There can hardly be a nationality more destitute of all that can invigorate and elevate a people than that which is exhibited by the descendants of the French in Lower Canada, owing to their retaining of their peculiar language and manners. They are a people with no history and no literature."
Oh, there's a lot of problems with that statement. First and foremost, the rebellion wasn't just in Lower Canada.
Right. Thank you.
God, Durham, didn't you listen to the podcast? We had a whole episode on what was going on in Upper Canada.
Now, obviously, it was more exacerbated in Lower Canada, but definitely.
For sure.
Right? First of all, complete misunderstanding of geography, or complete will to ignore it. Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of willful ignorance there. Again, that major oversimplification of that's part of it. The whole French versus English thing. The fact that there was another rebellion in Upper Canada just drives the point home. There was French and English problems because the French were the people and the English were the elite.
Exactly. Right.
And no history and language, or no history and no literature. Oh boy.
Now we're going to unpack that, right, as we get into the solutions that Durham proposes. But that whole section, I think, encapsulates so precisely how the British see the French Canadians, right? As being this really subpar group of people, as being these people who...
Subpar citizens.
Yeah, subpar citizens who lack this quote unquote, huge air quotes, civility to attain the power and stature and status of British people.
They tried reform through elections, and they tried sending you all the pretty stuff, and then you stuffed it up the bum hole.
Everything that would have made them more British in your eyes, you completely ignored. And I think there's a really interesting word choice here just before the end of the passage I mentioned, to their retaining of their peculiar language and manners.
Yeah, it's so well written, but it's all just such lies. It's very well written, though. Again,
but I'm pointing to it because I think just those 4 words really sum up how they viewed them, right? The French Canadians were complete others. Even though they had they had like a solid society, they had, yes, okay, they were poorer in general, but they had their own traditions and stuff, and it was just so elitist.
Them with their peculiar language of French. Who speaks French besides our neighbors right below us?
Exactly. Like, who is this weird person that speaks French and is arguably one of... It's like this nation that has proven itself as producing great works of art in the past, but not these guys, not them.
Having a solid like 200 years of history when Jacques Cartier got there.
At that point, like more like 300.
Yeah. No history, no art, no literature. Again, that's, of course, it's short for, say, the British, who have had their little colonies for thousands of years now, but like still, they didn't have none.
No, and it kind of throws a wrench in this idea of Durham as a Whig.
Durham's a moron. That's what he is.
Honestly, I hate like just generalizing against people like that. And we started off this conversation by saying like, oh, this guy's more nuanced. But also once you read shit like this, you're like, God damn, this fucking guy. So anyway, the solutions in general, we've alluded to, responsible government, union, and so on and so forth.
We ranted and raved a little bit.
It's important to make sure that these bases are understood, because to Durham, the whole goal, right, through these entire processes of merging the Canadas, bringing in a different form of government, and so on and so forth, was kind of threefold, right? And they all relate back to his initial politics that we covered at the beginning. So in the first place, and here's another quote from the report. This is later on in it.
Love it.
And this just drips with chauvinism. So that the solution, right, to the French Canadian, huge air quotes again, problem is to elevate them from that inferiority that I desire to give Canadians our English character. Really hammering home this point that the French Canadians...
I spit in your general direction. Oh, that quote hurts me. I get why they rebelled now.
Why they rebelled even harder after, right? In 1839. You laugh, but pretty much, right? We're going to talk about the immediate aftermath of this report, but it just kind of kickstarted this thing in Canada on so many levels that, whatever, we'll get to it.
I understand. I'm sorry I ever said that, if I ever said what I ever said about the stupidity of the rebellions.
Oh, yeah, you take it all back now.
I get it, if this is what this guy is calling you.
If this is the best reformer that you can send to Canada and he's what you're calling you, you failed. You failed as an empire. You have failed morally, right? And
turn it to the ground.
Honestly, yeah. So the idea of the unions of the two Canadas had a bit more depth and layers to it. And mostly it related to wanting to create an English majority and install a completely English political, social, and economic system, right? Which in itself would kind of create this British hegemony in North America and strengthen their power in that area to kind of compete with the United States and really install a greater association with empire, bringing it back again to the capitalist system that Durham really...
and the English character of capitalism.
Yes, to bring about this British capitalist system, but also it was meant to alleviate some of the debt that Upper Canada had accumulated over the past decades, as the family compact that we've mentioned a few times has kind of run the economy into the ground, and every attempt that they made has kind of failed. So these systems were also meant to kind of reinvigorate the economy a bit. And by extension of that, by extension of the ubiquity of the English system, right? You mentioned the seigneurs and all that, of kind of replacing every facet of French Canadian society with kind of a trickle down British system, if you will, that eventually the French would kind of ease itself out of existence.
And again, like the union of the two Canadas is in and of itself a good idea. It did make sense for them to create a stronger base. They had dangerous southern neighbors. There was a lot of reasons why. Durham just decided to pick the worst reason why.
Yeah. If he had mentioned any other reason.
If he had said we should to unify for stronger political reasons for the USA to the south. Yeah.
Already that. Which was a concern, by the way. It was a legitimate concern for the British. It's something that you see all over the place. Even at the time, especially at the time.
Even now, we're still afraid of invasion by the U.S.
Right. You hear that rhetoric still today. Every time that he mentions something outside of the French Canadians or the ultimate British unity, you could have focused specifically on that part. He does mention it, but it just doesn't quite go through as well. Just go with that. Don't be a dick about it. I feel like I say that every episode. I've said that every episode for the past 4 episodes. Don't be a dick about it.
If we ever make a t-shirt, that's going to be the first thing we're going to have on it, just the quote.
Of a picture of Durham and don't be a dick about it.
Just the quote, don't be a dick, Patrick, 2020. Because, I don't know, because the idea of union of two Canadas, again, this is Durham going halfway. He made it halfway. Uniting the two, strong move. And it led to good things in the end. Canada is recognized as one of the strongest economies in the world.
Yeah, in that sense, sure.
But the reasoning why, he did the right thing for the wrong reasons.
If we were to condense all of that together, the goal was basically to ensure the Whig utopia. 100% British, 100% capitalist, 100% unified, strong economy. Right?
God, that's horrifying.
It really is.
I see why they rebelled.
That's going to be another t-shirt. I get it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I get the rebellions now.
But as we're kind of moving away from the report itself, obviously, looking at it from the vantage point of the 21st century, is the French-Canadian character gone? No, obviously not. Right? Quebec.
Black Quebecois wants to join the chat.
No, but right, there's still a significant portion of the province of Quebec and elsewhere in Canada that still speaks French.
Second national language of Canada is still French.
Exactly. But we're not going to talk about like the specific reasons for that perpetuity because we're getting close to like an hour and a half of recording at this point. But I do want to cover quickly the kind of immediate aftermath of that report.
Let's do it.
Was there anything else before we get into that you wanted to mention specifically about the report? Was there any other thoughts, many other criticisms? I'm sure we could go on for criticisms forever, but
it was well written.
Okay.
Like, if there's one thing you should take away, like, well written document, some good ideas, just for the worst possible reasoning.
Yeah, that pretty much sums up my ideas about it also. So in Britain, right, we're going to kind of separate it into two, the British reaction and the Canadian reaction. In Britain, it's probably the place where it got the most opposition, right? The report. Ironically enough, he forced himself to write it before he died to kind of really present it to his British peers.
Of course.
And they pretty much rejected everything except the idea of union out of hand.
Of course they did.
The idea of union was mostly accepted because the British agreed that the French needed to be assimilated, less because they agreed with Durham as a political entity himself. Sucks. Thus is the nature of empire, right?
Sounds about right.
Yeah. Again, the idea of a responsible government was pretty much rejected outright, even by Durham's Whig peers, because mostly the imperial power didn't believe that it could aptly divide local power and imperial power.
Right.
So basically what they would do is kind of create a middle ground of the already middle ground that was the responsible government option. So they would introduce, so what was then known as the Colonial Office, would kind of introduce the idea that the governor basically would form his own government composed of people from various parties and ideologies and act based off of their various ideas. He's not entirely beholden to him through election. There are still members of the government that are elected, like the Legislative Assembly and all that still holds. But it's not quite responsible government yet. That'll come later. And we have a whole episode planned on that one.
It's going to be great.
Oh, yeah. But
this is what you guys want to hear more about the British.
Look, strap in. If you don't like the British, strap in, because we're going to still have like 50 episodes worth of this before we get to Confederation, right? So,
and Confederation's a 10-part miniseries.
You have no idea, do you? It's going to be a long haul.
We're working on that. Don't worry, folks. I'm in discussions with... I'm negotiating.
No, it's not going to be 10 parts, but yeah, it's going to be a larger series, I think.
Larger than the Rebellions.
Not that much larger, but yeah. The point is, Britain, that's kind of what happens. Agree with the general idea of union, reject democracy.
Agree with the assimilation, because that's always worked.
Because who's going to fight them? Apparently the French Canadians.
Again.
In Canada, the reaction is a bit mixed. Right. And I wrote very, very concise notes about the reactions for each. The Anglophone merchants were absolutely 100% in agreement with everything that Durham said. They were like, hell yes, assimilate, unify, do everything you want.
Destroy.
Lord Durham, give me more.
Lord Durham, our savior.
The reformers, they agreed with the idea of responsible government. Union, they could live with, but they were like, okay, I look, it's not the greatest thing ever because you're kind of screwing over and misunderstanding why it started in the first place. But again, as you mentioned, Mackenzy, what you're enacting is good for the wrong reasons. So they were like at a 75% yes, I guess. As you would expect, there are two groups in Canada that would out of hand reject it, right? The Tories, classic Tories, would be like, fuck no, this is bullshit. We don't want to be a unified British North America or unified Canada.
Fuck off, you wanker.
As we'll see as we go along, a lot of the Tory ideology was very much what we would today call provincialism, I guess. They were very much proud of their specific province of Nova Scotia and Lower Canada and Upper Canada and Newfoundland, right? And that they stay separate and kind of build their own little distinct cultures there. And the idea of union was really not that great. Right?
No,
and
well, not for them.
Giving too much democracy either through responsible government, no. Also, from an economic standpoint, the Union of the Canadas, which was meant to supplant the economic failure, for example, of Upper Canada with all its debt that it had accumulated, was kind of an admission of failure of the family compact that had run stuff, as we've mentioned before, for quite some time and kind of run the economy into the ground. And finally, what do you think the French Canadians said to this?
Hey, tabarnak, c'est quoi ça? Colin!
I wasn't expecting this at all. This made my day. Hearing you swear in French legitimately.
Hey, Colis. Hey, Durham, stick it up your ass, why don't you?
I think this was the funniest thing I heard all day, and I love it so much. Thank you for this. For English-speaking listeners, Mackenzy basically just swore.
What the fuck is this?
Yeah. We have like a series of French-Canadian swear words that are all religious-based, and that's what Mackenzy was saying. French Canadians were...
Shocker, they didn't want to be assimilated.
They didn't want anything to do with this. They were like, what the hell? No. Absolutely not.
This is so bad, we're going to rebel. Again.
Indeed, yeah. So the report was presented in, February? And by November, they were pretty much, already rebelling again. I don't know if it was a direct response to Durham.
I can see it being part of it.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can definitely.
I'd rebel too.
100%. As we're kind of winding down here, we kind of alluded to the fact that the report, while it would be partially enacted, would not necessarily have the intended effect on the Canadas. Spoiler alert, French Canadians still exist in Canada, right?
I don't know if anybody who's noticed.
Yeah. Surprising as it may be, there are still people who speak French here and who proudly associate with being French Canadians, and good for them, right?
Us too included with our ancestors.
Oh, yeah. So the impact of the Durham report, as we're going to see throughout the upcoming episodes, is mostly the political reality would shift. And as that shifting political reality would become greater, it would kind of shift also the way the report panned out. So for example, I wrote down here, the party system would kind of arise. And instead of being a place where you would associate politically with people that were similar in religion and language than you, as was typically the case, now you really associated with an ideology rather. Right? So that kind of throws a wrench in what Durham was saying of Canada being a place of ethnic politics and ethnic strife, right? His language, not ours.
Almost like he was wrong from the very beginning.
Almost. Now, obviously, there's no way of saying that if the party system hadn't arisen when it did in Canada, that wouldn't have been the case. But as it was, the way that politics kind of evolved in Canada, people associated with ideas more than language or religion as time would go on, and that definitely shifted the dynamics of the population.
Well, I'm more referring back to when he was making that big deal about it was the French versus the English, not the people versus the government or whatever.
Yeah, definitely.
It's almost like his idea was wrong from the very beginning in that perspective.
Just to cap this off, in case it wasn't really evident,
Durham's a piece of shit.
Hot take. But things would start to change much more rapidly as time goes on. Not just in terms of party ideology, but also despite there being already a rising sense of French Canadian nationalism that was kind of growing before the report and before the rebellions, after the report, it would just keep cranking way up, right? The French Canadians were really determined to prove Durham wrong in his idea that they have no history and no literature. And they were like, well, first of all, we do, but also we're going to prove you wrong by producing even more.
God, good. Like, I'm 100% there for doing things out of spite and pettiness.
I don't know if it was all out of spite. It's the kind of thing that like creativity begets creativity, I think.
Also, spite begets creativity. Like, sure. And I get it. Like, yeah, like if somebody tells me I can't do something like that, it's like if somebody came up to me and said, you can't write an essay or something. It's like, do you know what I study? I'm an English literature like essays is all I do.
That being said, do you have any final thoughts? Yes, okay, Durham's. I wasn't going to say it again. But do you have anything that you want to kind of end this off, or do you want to end the show there?
I think reflecting on the Durham report as the last part is the most important part of understanding these rebellions, and most importantly, why it happened. Because we look back and we say, why would they rebel against this big British Empire? And you come to understand, like, it was kind of insulting.
Kind of.
To put it very kindly, it's a bit as though, like, I can definitely say I've learned a lot more, and I'm a lot more understanding of what happened at the time.
I kind of get a bit more why he was painted as a villain. Where at first I was like, okay, again, I mentioned this before, he was nuanced, he had ideas, but it seems to have kind of slipped completely out of control, or deliberately so. I don't know, but it definitely does give me a better appreciation of that moment in Canadian history. And I would be actually curious to push this idea further of the report as what we would typically imagine as conventional literature. So, okay.
For sure.
Honestly, this was great. I really learned a lot today.
Same.
So,
go us. Good job.
Yay, us. So, as always, thanks everyone for listening. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, we have Facebook, Twitter, an email. It's all in the description.
We're happy to learn more.
Oh yeah, honestly, that's something I should learn to do more, is to interact with the social media more and just actively seek out questions or answers from people.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, honestly, if you want to, even if you want to just send in to the email or to the Facebook, like just a little tidbit on Canadian history or just a criticism of the show, please. I really want to hear them.
We get better through criticism.
Obviously, if you want to support the show, there's all the regular stuff. There's PayPal, there's Patreon. We're working on a new series right now, which is set to be released very soon. Leave a review on iTunes because it kind of helps to boost the show quite a bit, and that's always nice to get it to more people's ears. That being said, Mackenzie, why don't you introduce us to the show that you are spearheading for the Patreon?
We're going to have a couple different things on Patreon, but the first one and the big one that we're going to be doing is called Pop Canada. And so what that show is going to be about is it's going to be about the large role that Canada plays in the current world of pop culture. For example, special effects in Canada are actually pretty big and used in major movies throughout the industry. Same with filming locations. Canada is a very popular spot for filming locations, both as an urban place and as for our parks and our forests and so on and so forth.
It's always nice to see Montreal in various places.
Oh my God, when I was watching John Wick Part 2 and like they just drive down St. Catherine Street, I remember looking at my dad and I was just like, is that the Victoria's Secret on St. Catherine Street?
Yes.
Yes. But our first episode is going to be on Cirque du Soleil, discussing how much it's changed the world of circus, contemporary circus life, its long-reaching effects, its long-reaching shows, what it came about, why it's so cool, why it's so important. We're really excited to do it. It's gonna be a bit more informal than this. Fair warning to that. It's gonna be more open-ended as a discussion, and there's not gonna be any sort of chronology to it. We're just gonna be sort of going over these major points of how Canada has a sort of hidden role in the world's pop culture.
Yeah, I'm really excited for it. Honestly, this sounds like a really interesting project. As Mackenzie said, he's kind of the one who's spearheading it more, and I am really excited because it forces me to kind of think about pop culture in ways that I haven't in quite some time, and I'm really excited to do that. Was there anything else you wanted to say?
Durham's a piece of shit.
Words to live by.
Don't be a dick. Words to live by.
No, but seriously, thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.